I'm a psychologist, so I can't talk without visual aids. It's impossible. So you have to apologize for having some slides here. And this is going to be completely different because I'm just trying to give you a little background on some basic cognitive psychology that might be relevant to the discussion going on today. I'm going to talk about the human cognitive architecture and how that might be relevant to cutting through the bureaucracy and complexity of the rules. This is kind of a model that's of how we process information. It's obviously a gloss. It gets more complex the deeper you get into it, especially when you start trying to relate it to neurocognitive substrates. But it's a handy heuristic for how we process information. Initially, information comes in, we hold it in our sense memory, which is just auditory, visual stimuli coming in. It's there briefly for like 3 to 7, like a half a second to 3 seconds, and then we forget about 90% of it, which is a good thing because otherwise you'd go crazy. So once it's in sense memory, we somehow attend to certain things depending on our current state of affairs, our objectives, our goals, prior experiences. We select some information from our sensory input to enter into working memory. This is where like a lot of the action of thinking takes place. So in working memory, this is Miller's famous 7 plus or minus 2. We can hold about 7 units of information. What a unit is depends on what you know. So if you're a young kid learning to read, a unit might be letters. If you're older, an experienced reader, a unit might actually be phrases or concepts. But you can hold about 7 pieces of information. It stays in working memory for just a few brief time, but we have techniques we use to keep stuff in working memory if we're trying to work with it. So rehearsal, those of us who are old enough to have had to look up phone numbers in a phone book and go dial it on a phone. I'm aging myself there. You'd look up in the phone book and say, okay, 506, 575, 2525, and say that as you're walking, which is my parents' old number. So that's rehearsal. We keep stuff in mind. We also can bring stuff in from long-term memory into working memory to process. Key thing is working memory is very limited. Long-term memory is practically infinite, but the key is to find the proper retrieval cues to bring stuff from long-term memory into working memory so we can process and integrate what we're learning right now. And that's a phenomena that, again, as I get older, I say, I know the name of that researcher, what is that? And I have to try to say, okay, well, they worked out on the East Coast, and then, oh yeah, it was so-and-so. So it takes a while to retrieve it and bring it into working memory. So I want to explore this working memory. As I said, that's where a lot of the important stuff takes place. This is John Sweller came up with this model talking about cognitive load. And his point is, since working memory is a limited capacity, you have to think about how you're filling it up. And in any kind of learning process, you have intrinsic load. That's just how complex something is. So if you're teaching kids mathematics, addition is going to be less complex than if you're teaching them multiplication. So there's a certain inherent complexity to any new information being learned. There's extraneous load. There's certain cognitive resources that are needed just to process information. If decoding text, listening to a speaker, if the speaker's kind of mumbling and not talking clearly, then it's a higher cognitive load. It's harder to process that information. So that's extraneous load. Germane load is the effort you're making to actually learn it, integrate it into long-term information, and then hopefully you have a little bit of free memory left to process and think and be creative. I study learning, so we use this model to design learning materials and thinking about we don't want to increase too much the extraneous load and then the students can't learn. One of the things I do is build video games for learning. And part of the problem there is often people put so much effort into the game that they forget about the learning content. And if the kids are focusing too much on playing the game, then they're not going to be having enough cognitive space left to actually learn the content we're trying to teach. All right, so as I said, the extraneous load is the non-essential information And if I'm thinking about stuff we talked about today with bureaucracy, laws, regulations, if you have a very complex written text that, is more bureaucratic and not as clearly written as need be, you're going to be taking up resources, cognitive resources, to process the content of that information needlessly. So that would be extraneous load. If you have super complex laws and regulations, maybe it's written clearly, but it's so complex that it takes so much resources that you can't, you're overloading your cognitive resources just trying to process these complex rules and regulations, and that can be overloading and not leave room for creativity and thinking. And that's that little free spot there at the end. You need some room left over in your working memory to think, to brainstorm, to come up with new ideas, to remember past solutions, to imagine what possible creative solutions might be. And if you're overloading either from extraneous or intrinsic load, then you're not going to have the resources to be creative, to think. And there, leave it on that one. Just a couple of last parting thoughts. Part of what we do in our research is think about ways to enhance working memory. One of the ways we do this is through emotions. So we design materials that induce positive emotions, and this actually increases the working memory that students have. They can learn better. Conversely, if you're kind of upsetting people, then it contracts their working memory. They have less resources cognitive resources to put towards a task. They are less creative in solving solutions. So again, thinking about the frustrations of being surrounded by rules and regulations that feel constricting, you can imagine that induces negative emotions, and then you can get this sort of negative feedback loop going. So that's one of the concerns, sort of from my perspective. And finally, I'm in education, so the talk today just kind of reminded me of something that my advisor, David Olson, wrote about 10 years ago, about the need to sort of, he didn't call it deregulating, but he said reducing some of the restrictions within education. And he talked about it in terms of rights and responsibilities, starting with the student. The student has a right to have access to material to learn, but has a responsibility for learning. The student has to be responsible for themselves. The teacher, on the same token, should have the rights to have access to all the resources they need to teach the student and set up a proper environment for the student to learn, and so on, all the way up the bureaucratic ladder. So it's really empowering each person in that whole structure to do what they're doing, whether it's learning, teaching, providing resources to learn. And so I think that's an analogous from my world to yours. So thank you.